We left off in class on Wednesday talking about different types of retrieval cues for your memory. Now, just as a refresher, memory involves those three core components: encoding, storage, and then retrieval. So we discussed the various retrieval cues that could bring about that information that you had encoded and then previously stored for a period of time, either short-term or long-term, or in the case of sensory memory, very short-term. So now that we've talked about the different types of encoding and storage mechanisms, as well as the different types of retrieval cues, let's kind of dive into the different forms of, or the different types of memory within your long-term memory. The first of which is explicit memory. And this organizational hierarchy is just to give you an idea of what is included within the different types of long-term memory. So there's two core types of long-term memory. The first is explicit memory. And explicit memory is really memory that occurs consciously. It's something that you have to consciously bring about and retrieve from your past experiences. So, for example, if I asked you what you did for spring break last year, or what happened on Game of Thrones last night, you would have to consciously think back to it, and you may even physically use the phrase, "I remember." And this is conscious recall of your explicit memory. Implicit memory, however, occurs when past experiences influence later behavior and performance, but without trying to bring those out of your conscious awareness, without making an effort to actually remember those. So not using that phrase, "I remember." So let's talk about each one in a little more detail. Within explicit memory, there's both semantic memory as well as episodic memory. Now, you may remember the term semantic memory from our talks about types of encoding. There's semantic encoding, giving something a meaning. And in this case, maybe giving something a past experience so that you'll remember it better. That would be a way to encode something. But let's talk more about semantic memory. So as I said, explicit memory is the act of consciously retrieving past experiences, using that phrase, "I remember." And this type of information is processed in your hippocampus. So memory of facts and general knowledge are really what make up explicit memory. If I were to ask you, who's the President of the United States? Information that you're gaining right now and in all of our class periods. Hopefully this will turn into your explicit memory, something that you can consciously recall from areas in the past, from learning and knowledge that you've gained in the past. It can also be, as I said, personally experienced events, which can also help you add to that idea of semantic encoding. In addition to that, retelling stories of your past experience, like, "Hey, this one time," or "Do you remember last weekend?" These are all types of explicit memory that you might be using. So, explicit memory, a network of facts and concepts that make up our general knowledge about the world. Episodic memory, however, is a collection of past personal experiences that occurred in a particular time and place. So episodes. So if you think about it like episodes in television, each one of those has occurred in a particular setting at a particular time. That's what gives them their funny anecdotes. But what's interesting about episodic memory is it allows us to engage in mental time travel. And while we all hope that time travel becomes readily available to us in the future, at this point I'm talking about mental time travel to the past, or even the present, or the future. So the past you may recollect on episodic memories that have already occurred. Thinking back to your 5th birthday and thinking about the things that you did at your 5th birthday are representations of your episodic memory. The present I like to think of it as daydreaming. So if you are thinking about other things while you're consciously focused on something else, you may be engaging in present time travel. You're just traveling away from where you're physically at. And then future. Anytime that you try and view, when someone asks you, where will you be in 10 years? And you try and visualize yourself in that way, you're using a portion of this episodic memory in order to mentally time travel to another place, projecting ourselves into the past or into the future and revisiting events in this form, or visiting for the first time in the case of the future. And I just like this clip, Back to the Future, although I would guess that the large majority of you have not seen this movie. If so, go out and rent it. It's really good. So going back to our organizational hierarchy, let's now look at the other side of it. Implicit memory. Don't forget, these are things that we don't have to consciously recall. We don't use that phrase, I remember. Implicit memory, as I said, occurs when past experiences influence later behavior. And within implicit memory, there's two subtypes of implicit memory, both procedural memory as well as priming. So let's talk a little bit about those. Once again, implicit memory occurs automatically. You don't have to consciously recall it. These are going to be things like riding a bike. When they use that phrase, oh, it's just like riding a bike, what they're really referring to here is your ability to remember implicitly. You don't have to consciously think, oh, I need to put my foot on the pedal and then my hands on the steering wheel or the handlebars and then start propelling yourself. You just get on the bike and you ride it. It's kind of the same thing with tying your shoe. You don't think about the steps that you take to actually tie your shoe at this point. You just do it. You're so in tune with the process of doing these tasks that you don't think about it. Like brushing your teeth, hopefully, for most of us. So, when you talk about these things, riding a bike or tying your shoe, it's much easier. You might be able to describe riding a bike, but can you really explain how to do it? And I like to think of it in my own personal example as trying to teach someone how to snowboard. I know how to snowboard. I think that I would be able to teach it, but then when you get on a mountain and you really try and put into words what you implicitly know, it becomes much more difficult. Try and think about how you would teach someone to balance and ride a bike. It's a lot more difficult than you would think. So, procedural memory is really a gradual acquisition of skills as a result of practice. It's the same thing you used when you were learning to walk or to crawl or to talk or to ride that same bike. You have to practice before you can fully and accurately complete any of these tasks. So, what's interesting about procedural memory is that people with amnesia can actually still perform these tasks. Just because someone gets amnesia, they aren't magically unable to walk or talk or sometimes even ride a bike. So we conclude that procedural memory isn't associated with the hippocampus, and other parts of memory actually are. So it's different. Procedural memory is in a different portion of the brain than the hippocampus, so we think. So that's procedural memory. Now let's talk about priming. So priming is the ability to remember something because you've already been recently exposed to it. So just like when you put a primer on for paint, it happens prior. You've been previously exposed to something, and so you're more likely to remember it in future instances. Now let's look at an example of priming in effect. So, if I were to ask you, spell the word hair. Out loud, in your mind, just try and spell it. Okay. What most of you probably spelled in your head, or out loud maybe, was H-A-I-R, hair, meaning the stuff we've got on our head. But if I were to activate your memory using a certain stimulus, you may, in fact, see an entirely different thing. So if I were to show you a picture of a rabbit, and then I were to ask you to spell hair, you would maybe spell H-A-R-E, as in a type of rabbit. And so seeing these extra stimuli will help you to associate things that you and it unconsciously activates these associations so that you could spell the correct form of hair as opposed to the one that may automatically come to mind. So priming is an enhanced ability to think of a stimulus, such as a word or an object, hair, for example, as a result of recent exposure to the stimulus. Lots of big words. But basically what I mean is I show you a picture of a rabbit and you're going to spell hair H-A-R-E instead of H-A-I-R. So now I want to talk to you about social influences on memory, the effects that other people have on your ability to remember things. And you don't think about your personal memory being a social entity, but it can really be affected by the knowledge that other people are trying to remember the same things that you are. For example, if you were to conduct a study and you were to separate the class divided into an experimental group and a control group, remember, random assignment into these two groups, and for one group, I was to ask every individual person to remember as many words as they could from a list of 20 words, much like the activity that we did in class on Monday. So I ask you to remember every word that you can from this list of 20 words, but I want each of you to individually try and remember them, and then I'd like you to come together and share with your group what you've come up with. That's Group A. Group B, I would like for you to collaborate as a group from the very beginning and try and remember as many words as you possibly can. If we were to look at the results of this study and compare the number of words that each group was able to remember, what we would find is the group that singularly tried to remember words and then came together, the nominal group, would actually remember more words than the group that began to collaborate from the very beginning and used their collective memories from the very beginning. And this is extremely interesting to me, but it occurs for a number of reasons. The first of which is social loafing. It's this idea that someone else in the group will do the remembering for you. And if any of you guys, and I know you have been in group projects, then you're aware that there's one person that always takes the lead and does a lot of the work, and there's always that one person that fails to do any of the work or does a very minimal portion of the work, but still gets the same grade. Well, this is what occurs. Not everyone in the group is actively trying to remember to the best of their ability. They're leaving it to the leader of the group to remember all of these words. So that's social loafing. Some person that is unwilling to help to their fullest capacity due to the fact that they can push the responsibility off on someone else. Another reason for this is retrieval strategies. Oftentimes when someone else is coming up with retrieval strategies and they're doing the speaking, the strategies that one person might use, or those retrieval cues that one person might use, are interrupted, and their thought process is interrupted, and then they're no longer able to remember or use those types of retrieval cues to add to the collective group of words. Another interesting type of memory are called flashbulb memories. And when I think about these, I like to think about cameras from the ancient days, a very, very long time ago. Those cameras that had a bulb that were used as the flash, and it was only a one-time use. You put the bulb in, you took the picture, flash, and then you had to use another bulb for the next picture, which would be very tedious. If anyone's into photography, they would know how time-consuming that would be. Now you take 120 shots in a minute, or maybe even more than that. Well, flashbulb memories are clear, detailed memories of emotionally significant events. So the first one probably that comes to mind, especially in our generation, is going to be 9/11. You think back. It's one of those, where were you when 9/11 occurred? And you think back and you remember, maybe, I was in a classroom, I was at school, it happened right after I'd been dropped off by my mom. And then you think about what you felt. So you not only think back to the physical areas that you were at, but you also think back to those emotional thoughts and feelings that you were having at that time. And so flashbulb memories seem to be etched in our minds. However, as people relive the event and discuss it with others, these memories can often become distorted. So just as when you retrieve information from your storage, you can often change that memory when you put it back into storage at a later time. So think about it for just a second. Besides 9/11, what are some recent flashbulb memories for Americans? Okay. Well, you may have thought of a few. But flashbulb memories don't have to be traumatic for a large group of people. It's oftentimes could be just traumatic for one person. Deaths in the family may be such traumatic events that you remember exactly where you were when you got the phone call or when you heard the news. And they're just very emotionally influencing memories that seem to be etched in your brain like a photo. So think back to that story I told you in chapter 2 about how sometimes our brain is doing so many things that oftentimes we're just on autopilot for other functions. The story I believe I told you is that you go to a Redbox machine, and I thanked the Redbox machine. And that's just an example of my brain doing so many things at once that it kind of has a computer glitch, much like your computer or your iPhone might have. So the same is true with memory. Memory failure can also occur, and there's a number of reasons why. I won't go into too much detail, but I want to give you some overview of why. So first, there's transience. And transience, this is the idea that memories can and do degrade over time. This occurs after the storage phase of memory. So after an experience has been encoded, you've brought the information in, but before it's retrieved at a later time, forgetting happens soon after the event. Think back to that chart I showed you about how memory is encoded and then stored and then retrieved, and some of that is lost through decay. This is the idea of transience. Absent-mindedness, which we are all guilty of doing. Absent-mindedness is really just your lapse in attention, and this results in memory failure. When you're sitting in class or when you're listening to this and you look over and you begin to think about something else for a second, then you're not remembering the information that is being brought to you. So this usually happens as a result of divided attention. If you've ever been in a car and been on the phone or been thinking about something else and you get home and you realize, I don't remember what route I took to get home. That's the idea of divided attention and absent-mindedness. Another example of memory failure is blocking. And it's the failure to retrieve information that's available in your memory. It's one of those tip of the tongue phenomenons. You know that you know it, but you can't actually retrieve that information even though it's right at the edge of your brain or the tip of your tongue. This frequently happens when people are trying to recall places and people, the names of people in particular. There's memory misattribution. And misattribution is assigning a memory to the wrong source. So I mentioned to you the case of Timothy McVeigh and the Murr Building. And this was a case of memory misattribution. He gave his memory to the wrong man, and then the wrong man was actually caught in the beginning. They fixed it. They sorted it all out, no worries. Then there is memory bias, and this is distorting present knowledge on recollection of previous experiences. So current moods can bias the way that you recall events. If you're in a bad mood, it's going to change the way that you recall an event. If you're in a great mood, it's also going to change how you felt about an event that maybe upset you very much the first time. So your emotions can bias you towards your past memories. Next is persistence. Persistence is remembering events that we wish to forget. Everyone has those events that when they think of, they just cringe, whether it be a night after drinking excessively, a breakup, a terrible breakup that you had with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, an instance of cheating, maybe, in your educational setting. All events that you just don't want to remember. And emotional experiences tend to be remembered better than the non-emotional. So anything that made you angry or nervous or fearful, those are persistent memories that you'd really like to forget, but they just keep creeping back in your brain. The final one is suggestibility, and this is the idea that someone can incorporate a suggestion and then it becomes part of your personal memory. These can also turn into false memories. So if you thought what I said earlier sounded a bit like Inception, someone planting an idea in your head and then it becoming a realistic memory, that actually might be the case. So false memories, like I said, are ones that can be planted. Think back to Inception. It's just this idea that someone gives you this idea and you come to believe it so thoroughly that it becomes a memory and it never actually even occurred. This actually happens to me all the time. I think for some reason that I was on a submarine when I was a kid. I 100% have not been on a submarine. But man, if that is not a very vivid memory in my brain that was planted in there at some point in time. So children are more susceptible to false memories, mainly due to the plasticity of their brain and this ability to convince them of almost anything. They're very gullible people. And they're just little people. But they're very gullible people. And so it would be much harder at this point in my life to try and tell me that I had done something that I actually had not done. I just simply wouldn't believe it unless there was some level of intoxication involved. However, children, much like my submarine story, this is a point in time that I began to believe that I was on a submarine and still have this false memory. So it's very, very vivid imaginations of things that did not actually occur. This is just a fun slide on ways to improve your memory. So if you're ever feeling absent-minded, divided attention, or if you're ever feeling biased about your memory, we've talked about each one of these, but they also are really good ideas for when you start to study for this exam. So keep in mind, and yes, the sniffing rosemary is an actual idea. It's apparently proven to help increase your memory and your retrieval cues. Thanks.